Happy to introduce my fellow citizen, Professor Tröhler, who was professor and director first at the Institute for the History of Medicine in Göttingen from 83 to 94, and then he moved as a director of the Institute of History of Medicine at the University of Freiburg, not the real Freiburg, which everybody knows is in Switzerland, but the false Freiburg, which is in Germany, in Breisgau. He is now an emeritus professor, but as he pointed out, he is still very active in working at the Institute for Social and Preventive Medicine in Bern, and also as a co-editor of the James Lind Library. So, Professor Tröhler, please.
Thank you, dear compatriot. Thank you evidently for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me and also an honor to present to you some of my research work, some of which goes back about 40 years, and some is very recent. So, as you have noticed, I've changed the title a little bit. It's now Numbers in 18th and 19th Century European Surgery. Because speaking in Quebec, I thought, well, I cannot really leave out the French. I must say that George Weiss has for me, fantastically prepared the background. And I hope you will realize what's coming out now in front of the background which he showed to you. I start my talk with asking a question. Why on earth would an 18th century surgeon show the results of his practice? And why should he use numbers? Now the answer can be found in a first slide, which shows you a typical traditional surgeon. Here you see him. He turns up on a market square. He has propaganda material with him. He has a servant, one doesn't see it very well here. He has a servant who shows a diploma certifying that he has operated in another city very successfully. He is, in other words, an itinerant craftsman. He sticks to the dogma based on tradition and has a commercial motive for using numbers as a craftsman, namely to boast of his success in established operations, which are, since antiquity, cutting for the bladder stone, couching the lens of the opaque lens in cataract, and to a certain extent also amputation, although this was more an affair of military surgeons, and in civilian practice it was done in hospitals, here in blue. They were rare, they were innovative, academic 18th century surgeons. I have here a whole gallery of them. They turned up in England, in Scotland, France, in Prussia, and again in England. And you see their headgears are different, representing different social status. The second from the left is a professor of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh. The third is a physician who turned an eye surgeon, French physician. The fourth here is a Prussian, native Swiss again, who had worked in France and became, at the end, the head surgeon of the Prussian army of Frederick the Great. And here we have an English hospital surgeon. And the first to the left was a surgeon who took part in the barber surgeon company before they divided into barbers and surgeons in England. Now I say these people were rare, that's clear. But they were skeptical hands to innovate. They presented their results in publications, not in propaganda material, and had moral motives for using numbers, also some personal motives, be it said. And I already hinted to the point that there was an innovation in the three classical great operations in the 18th century. And I shall now look at the evidence which was brought forward to make these innovations known. Let us first state with William Cheselden, the man whom we have seen already. And he published reliable, factual results of, in a book on anatomy written in English, innovative, not in Latin, and he published results for cutting for the stone. I cannot, you see here the figures are in the texts. I have presented them more readably here. Don't read them really, because here they come. What has he done? His method was the analysis of his own private records. When you read the text, you find all this. It's difficult to find, but you find it. So he had 213 publicly operated for lithotomy, and 20 were dead. And he divided the patients according to their age groups. And you see immediately that he operated mostly on children and young adults, where the lethality was rather low. There were very few patients older than 40 or 50 with a higher lethality. So this is a first step really of counting and accounting. He networked with Sauveur François Morin in Paris. There was an exchange of data. And we can say that Cheselden's data remained the standard of comparison for the rest of the century. We shall see this in a moment. And I have no idea why he did, how he came to do this. It was his personal initiative. I couldn't find that out from his biography. And when I say his data will remain the kind of standard, I shall illustrate this in a moment. Now we come to the question of treatment of cataract, and we turn to 18th century Paris, where we see in 1708 famous French surgeon Pierre Dionys. Here you see him with his wig à la Louis XIV. And we hear him saying, actually he wrote it in his textbook, Cours d'opération de chirurgie, la certitude de la chirurgie est manifestement trouvée par les effets merveilleux qu'elle produit. The certainty of surgery is manifestly shown by the effects which it produces. L'opération de la cataracte rend la vue aux aveugles. Quote, 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 quote. And to conclude, enfin, rien n'est de plus sûr que ce qu'elle fait. This is a statement of a rule. Certainty is there. Fantastic, isn't it? When one can say something like that. But now, 45 years later, this book was in his 5th edition by 1753. Jacques Daviel, already familiar to us, the physician of Rouen, who turned an eye surgeon, published a paper on l'extraction du cristallin, the extraction of the opaque lens, rather than the couching of the lens. And now let us see the evidence. Here, à l'Hôtel Royal des Invalides in Paris, a prospective trial involving 3 surgeons and 17 patients was organized. The results, you see them here. 5 of the 8 patients gained sight after traditional couching, and 6 of the remaining 9 after innovative extraction of the lens. So this is an ambiguous result, small numbers. Consequence, the discussion continued for the rest of the 18th century on the basis of arguments, not on comparative data, as I shall show you on the next slide. Here we are now in Paris in 1825, where Anselme Barthélemy Richerand, here you see this man, friendly man, published an interesting book with the title Histoire des progrès récents de la chirurgie, where amongst others he said that surgery had made such progress that it could hardly be imaginable that it would go farther on. So this is an interesting statement, which comes up, by the way, from time to time in the history of medicine. And therein, one finds also a chapter on the treatment of cataract. Well, what's going on here? Here it is. And since you are in Quebec, I presume I can quote this in French, or I can summarize afterwards. This is a fascinating text. S'il est un cas où la vérité chirurgicale paraisse aussi difficile à découvrir, c'est sans doute celui où il s'agit de décider quelle est la méthode préférable pour guérir la cataracte et de mettre fin aux interminables débats qui de nos jours encore divisent les partisans de l'extraction et ceux de l'abaissement du cristallin. You got it. It's very well formulated. And now continue. And he formulates now really everything for a good clinical trial without randomization. And he says, une seule voie est ouverte pour sortir de ce dédale d'opinions contradictoires et fixer enfin ce point important de doctrine chirurgicale. Sous les yeux de l'Académie, un certain nombre de malades devraient être réunis dans un local convenable, puis opérés comparativement selon les 2 méthodes, en plaçant autant que possible dans les mêmes circonstances les individus soumis à l'opération. Un corps académique dont le seul intérêt est celui de la vérité peut seul entreprendre et suivre avec avantage une semblable expérience. Le chirurgien le plus habile ne saurait se défendre d'une multitude de préventions préjugées dont il ignore souvent lui-même l'existence et l'empire. This is really a great insight. It shows that there were no new data had been produced, really. He speaks of a dédale d'opinion, a mixture of opinions, and not of new data. And he designs a trial, a comparative, prospective trial. And because he's aware that even the most able surgeon has prejudices which he is not even aware of. As far as I know, such a trial has never been done. So we close now the chapter on the cataract. And we can say that this program of Richerand implied a lot, for it questioned the legitimacy of knowledge. Traditionally, the accent had been on the man, or savant. Who is he? Where has he studied? What credential does he have? That was the accent on which legitimated knowledge. It was a kind of social history of truth, as Stephen Shapin has very aptly shown in his book already published 25 years ago, nearly. And this new program now puts the accent on knowledge, pas le savoir, mais le savant. Pardon, pas le savant, mais le savoir. What is the evidence is the question. You have heard this. Quelles sont les preuves en français? And this leads to an epistemic history of truth. So now go back to the mid-18th century and we speak about amputation. And here we have a man, Alexander Monroe. We shall see him back in a few minutes, who in the Medical Essays and Observations of a society in Edinburgh publishes again results of this operation. About the same time as Cheselden had done. You can see them here. There have been 85 more patients in the infirmary who had the like operation performed on them, of whom 8 died. 2 of these, and this is now important, had violent constitutions of their body, and the limbs had a modification on them. The other 6 were all emaciated with hectic symptoms before the operation and survived it several weeks or months, so that the death of none of them can reasonably be imputed to the operation. You smile, you have understood the point. I make it because you have statistics here, and this problem of discussing away a death appears immediately. I have again made this, here your slide. You know already these 2 gentlemen. And the next one here on the right is this Swiss surgeon who studied a bit anatomy in Basel and Strasbourg, and then went to Paris, and had a brilliant career in the Prussian army. And he had really an experience of amputation during the 7 Years' War. And he realized, as a contemporary said, that amputation is an operation terrible to bear and horrid to see. I found an 18th century illustration in civilian practice, and you see this man here being held with by 4 or 5 others, and then crying, and because one would just chop off his leg. It is really terrible. And when we have seen this on the battlefield, he wondered, why should one actually operate? So, what did he do? He wrote a thesis in Latin. Here is the German title. During a battle break in the winter term, there were no battles in the 7 Years' War during the winter. People stopped. He was at Halle at the university, and he wrote a thesis in Latin, which had then the title in English, The Inutility of Amputation of Limbs. And he described in this thesis a conservative method of treatment of gunshot wounds. I will let you read this. This is very interesting. Unfortunately, was very rarely probably put into practice. And his method of analysis was retrospective, and he used the army returns which he had as a senior surgeon. They came to him. And at a certain moment during the 7 Years' War, he had 6,018 wounded. 557 were perfectly cured, fit for duty, 653 died, and 408 were semi or invalids, and none of them had been amputated. Although these, as he said, had compound fractures or complicated wounds and would usually have been amputated, according to the general rule. With 20%, with 10% death, you see from Monroe, this was known. So he claimed at the end that he had saved 1,800 patients from the horrid amputation and gave final evidence of 51 cases of shattered bones cured with his conservative treatment. Big success, you would say. And the continuation was something extraordinary, never heard of. This was a sensation. And his book was translated into 5 languages rather immediately. Another consequence was, strangely enough, that the indication for amputation was henceforth evaded in textbooks. This has been examined by a German scholar in the 1920s. I found this old paper. It became difficult to set up rules, and people want rules. But one realized one couldn't really set them up with these data. And the third continuation was that Bilger's text, being exaggeratedly formulated, made criticism easy. He was quite fanatic how he wrote it. So he had, of course, opponents and supporters. The opponents were the established surgeons from French, Dutch, and British hospitals. And the supporters were the military surgeons who knew what it meant to do this in great amounts. And there was one famous Swiss and later European physician, Simon André Tissot, a physician who supported his countryman very much. And this discussion were all on the basis of arguments, not on data. Also, on balance, one can say that probably there was no great change in views on amputation. The simple rules of chopping off the limbs simply persisted. And precise numbers were used, but as we have seen, in an unprecise way. And the impressive numbers, thousands, did not impress, finally. So, it was obviously easier to discuss an innovation of technique when then one amputated. One did not really fix a rule for the indication, but when one amputated, one could innovate the technique. And this was done by Edward Allenson, a Liverpool surgeon who was about 40 years old when he did this. I show him to you. Obviously he's older here. And he published a book, 1782, on the on amputation and after treatment. And here is now an example of the moral motive, which was often announced, written down in these cases of innovation. I read it out. When we attempt to introduce any new and important derivations from the common mode of practice into general use, and particularly in a point of such consequence as the directing almost a total change in the mode of performing and after treating one of the principal operations in surgery, the public have a right to be fully acquainted with the author's reasons for such attempts, and such trials should likewise previously have been made as are sufficient to demonstrate that the doctrine recommended will bear the test of general practice. This was directed against the very frequent use of single, selected, successful cases, which was really current in the 18th century. So here I have, sorry, I have forgotten that one, but I've read it. It's an important passage that one should make enough trials so that it would be the test of general experience. I have again made an extraction of this book. in what consisted his technical innovation, namely in the forming of flaps, muscular flaps to cover the amputated part. And he used a method of historic controls involving 81 patients. You see the results. 10 of 46 patients died after traditional technique. All survivors had severe complications. All the 35 which he had amputated with his innovative technique survived and had only slight fevers. His motivation, you have gathered that, was the responsibility towards the public. He insisted that he had included all cases which he had operated so far, and that all these operations were testified. They were testimonies. It was important for him. Also, this book was translated into French and German, and his technique was rather quickly adopted also on the continent, except in France. Again, this was a personal initiative, but he was part of this British movement of clinical arithmetic, which I shall describe you in a few moments. We continue. Another question, technical questions, you have hinted at that one, was the timing. Should one amputate immediately after an accident or after a certain delay? There were pathophysiological arguments for both, as actually is still the case in current accident surgery for intervention on wounds, and has been a long time during World War I. There are huge discussions about that. And here, again, we go back to France, mid-18th century. Here. This man, France comes later. This man here is George James Guthrie, who was probably the most outstanding British military surgeon of his time. He worked under Wellington in the Peninsular War against Napoleon from Portugal through the whole peninsula. There were plenty of battles. And I insist that he was not even, he was hardly above 20 years when he collected his data and published them in 1815, Treatise on Gunshot Wounds. And you see, here is a table. The figures are no longer in the text, but he has a table. And down here, you can see that he has even rates. He gives rates. You needn't read the figures. I have again made them more readable for you. What did he do? He did a retrospective analysis of army returns. We know this technique. And this is interesting for the ethicist, I did not feel myself authorized to commit murder for the sake of experiment. So he had a preconceived idea, of course. And the results, the comparative loss, the mortality of 551 delayed and 291 early amputations. Upper extremities was 12 times more, the mortality was 12 times greater than the immediate operated, and the lower extremities 3 times. The continuation, he foresaw a prospective trial of amputations of the side after the Battle of Toulouse, when they had come through the whole peninsula. And then he wrote that he regretted we had not had another battle to enable me to decide 2 or 3 points in surgery that were doubtful, because he wanted to make, nevertheless, a prospective trial. So for the British military and even also the naval surgeon, the question of early and late amputation was actually settled. And then came Waterloo, as you all know, and he had been on half pay, but he turned up as a private surgeon, and again kept records, but they were not were no longer published. He became a famous man. He was twice president of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, and had a great career afterwards, George Guthrie. As I said, the question seemed settled for military practice. The 6th edition of his book was in 1855 with all these statistics. He was also part of the British movement of clinical arithmetic. Now it's the time to show you what that was. I call these people, they were also active on the physician side of medicine, arithmetic observationalists and experimentalists. They quantified their observations. They were so-called marginal men, yet, as Guthrie, for instance, rose to important positions in the Army and Navy, and but they were all working outside the established Oxford and London colleges and academia. Also, individual important, and they had neither a real legacy of a school of thinking, yet it died not out in England, as I shall show in a minute. If you want to know more about this movement, I've published a book on that many years ago, and this book actually had quite a success with physicians. It was the book of the month in the Lancet and so on, because so many arguments turn up which are of actuality. So we come to the 19th century, and I have selected 2 surgical innovations. A new approach to removing bladder stones. We are still busy with this problem, and we are still busy today, as you know, with lithotripsy. But the lithotriptor of the 1830s looked like that. Horrible for the men, particularly. And of course, another old question. What is this? Turns suddenly on. New approach to the care for wounds. And here I allude, of course, to antisepsis. Please tell Microsoft the problem. Okay. This is again an old problem, as you have gathered. And antisepsis, as you will remember, was introduced by general opinions, not exactly true, as from 1867 on, particularly by Joseph Lister of Glasgow and later London. So, the use of the lithotripsy against lithotomy, the old operation. Up, come on. No. Cannot do more than press the thing. The machine doesn't work. Again, I bring you now to Paris, because the man who has invented this machine is a French surgeon of the name of Sivialet. And there was a discussion on statistical grounds in the Académie des Sciences in Paris in 1835. Monsieur Sivialet, the inventor, had assembled over 5,000 operations done by the lithotomy. And he gave the rate of keep presenting. Oh, yeah. I know it by heart. He gave the lethality, and he says that he had this data from the plus grand chirurgien actuellement existant en Europe. And what were the conclusions? Something is wrong. Now I would really need the... Okay, now we have to go through. Sorry, this is... c'est les inconvénients. Anyhow, the lethality was quite high, I forget now the number. And he compared these over 5,000 with 267, I think, of which only 20 had died, I think. Something like this. And he says, which is not the same thing. But he was the inventor, you see. And these data were presented by a mathematician and physician, Denis Poisson, who drew the attention of the assembly to the fact, okay, thank you, that one should use the the probability, which was in status nascendi at that moment, not just a cookbook mathematics with averages as you hinted to. So here we come probably now. We come now, yes, you see, this is all here in this text again. So this is an example of cumulative statistics, collected from les plus grands chirurgiens actuellement en œuvre en Europe. And here are the precise results. 5,715, 1,140 died, and 50% were below 14 years of old. This again, the Cheselden story comes up, you see, as I have announced. And the lithotripsy was 257, and only 6 were died. And only 2 or 3 individuals were younger than 14 years. What he did not say, of course, is that the lithotripsy was a thing which needed repetition. I have an autobiography of a Bernese aristocrat who lived in Paris and was lithotripsied by Jean Sivialet, and he suffered enormously. He had to go there every 6 weeks or even more frequently. This comes not out in that kind of comparative statistic, you see. It's not a prospective trial. It's cumulative statistics, and as you said, George, this was done and done and done again in the 19th century, the great century of surgical conquest of all the bodily cavities. There was a formal discussion in Paris in the Académie Royale de Médecine about statistics in therapeutics. And as you have said, there was opposition of the old school. How can probability replace our old certainty? La médecine deviendrait un casino de jeu. That's textual. A casino de jeu, you understand. And of course, individuality should be acknowledged. Numbers cannot represent biological variability, and of course one must respect the time-honored art médical, which it took, I think, 3 sessions of the Académie Royale de Médecine to explain what that was. It's verbiage, it's words. You cannot, it's difficult to summarize this. Anyhow, there were arguments, modern objections, pragmatical ones and theoretical ones. Pragmatical ones said, this is anyhow not feasible. You will never find 2 groups of 213 comparable patients in the 2 groups. That was the standard status of a calculus of probability by then. They are clinically inadequate, as you have said. We are treating individual patients and not groups, unless they are the military or the prisoners, with which you can examine, you can make experiments and so on, and they are ethically disputable because these things, these statistics, they imply horrible human experimentation. This went into French novel of the time, by the way. And not least, it is a tedious and troublesome business, as one frankly said, which was true. And of the theoretical ones, arguments were that these cookbook statistics were methodologically insufficient. One needed the application of calculus of probability, a complicated thing which did not interest the doctors at all. So, nevertheless, publication of factual results became a habit, as you said. Here I have just found authors who published results of amputations, and you have the lethalities here. They are variable, you see. You have said this as well. They were done in all over the world, even in Augusta in the United States. And I nevertheless will draw attention to Rutherford Alcock here, who was not even 30 when he accompanied British expeditionary force in the Carlist War in Spain, and had fantastic statistical reports on that. And this was the kind of foundation of all these statistical reports on every battle in Europe, and there were plenty throughout the 19th century. Alcock, by the way, fascinating man, was the first British ambassador to Japan and later to China. Made a diplomatic career. Just as a side note. Now, these were unilateral statistics. It's my oldest slide. And it says a lot, unilateral statistics. You understand the message. Now we come to Lister and the antisepsis. Or was it not sufficient just to be clean and use a lot of cold water and wash the instruments and wash your hands before when you operated? Here I have your friend, Spencer Wells. I show the slide to introduce you, and also to draw your attention that the antiseptic spray was used, and then of course the great innovation of the anesthesia. We will hear more about this also today. And here is the other side. I tried hard to find a slide. It's probably true. There's a kind of cold water method. You see here the assistant here washing up, and it's the anesthesia, so it's about the same time, but you have not all this complicated and maybe poisonous antiseptic stuff of acid carbolic. This was really a British debate which lasted more than 20 years old. And the two protagonists are shown here. The fields are separated in color. These are protagonists. This is Joseph Lister. He's about 40 years when this all begins. He's already an established man. This is Lawson Tate. Oh, sorry about that. He's only 25 years old. He's a combative man. His forthrightness, truculence, and enthusiasm brought upon himself numberless petty quarrels, major legal actions, scandals, and intrigues. You see the distinguished man, and also his status. He is rather a heavy man, but a fighter. Now let's look at the evidences. Lister starts in 4 years with 11 papers which show successful cases selected under antiseptic treatment. Tate writes 15 papers in 22 years where he brings dozens, yes, literally thousands of cases treated with cleanliness and cold water alone. Lister had one sole paper with statistics, a historical control, show it in a minute, whereas Tate was a keen statistician. He presented charts and tables, and he always showed an extremely low lethality. He did clinical experiments, unfortunately badly reported. And he always exhorted Lister, or Listerists, to publish comparative results, which Lister steadfastly refused, because he said statistics can be made to prove anything or nothing. Now let's look at the data. The issues about statistics are fascinating. I have analyzed last year 20 articles mentioning statistical issues in the controversy about antisepsis, mostly from the BMJ or Lancet. 13 were authored by Lawson Tates, and the results were kind of generalities. There are people who are pro-statistics, they are the element of the debate, or contra. One crucial example is better than any amount of statistics, quote, or neutral. It all depends on interpretation, which is true. And then, most interesting, people were aware of the requirements for useful statistics. Compare the comparable, no selection, great numbers. And also of the fallacies of statistics. Historical controls are not adequate because the situation can change, the surrounding hospital can be cleaned and so on. And the famous post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, they were aware of that, and the inconsistencies of statistics. And here now, Lister's statistics, sole statistical paper, you see he did historical control before the antiseptic period, 1864, 1866. During the antiseptic period, duck, duck, duck. But 1 year is lucky, namely 1865, strangely enough. And he said, the hospital records are unfortunately imperfect for one of the 3 years immediately preceding the antiseptic period, which was not true, as I shall show you in a moment with the help of another statistician, namely here he analyzed the records of the Glasgow infirmary, and I could arrange the data so they are comparable, and they show you the amputations of the upper limb in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary, the whole infirmary, and in Lister's ward. Unfortunately, we have no absolute numbers here. So you see that before the antiseptic treatment started, the death rate in Lister's ward was considerably higher than in the whole infirmary. And it went down then in the Lister's ward. Case numbers are small, sorry, I cannot move this thing. Whereas they went up in the general infirmary. Now this is interesting because obviously he cheated, because he did not, he said that there were no data, but the data exists. And you understand why he did that, to make the effect more conspicuous. And this becomes even more clear when you increase the range of time. And this has been done by David Hamilton. And you see here the death rate of compound fractures of the upper limb. And you see that, now it's important to have the arrow. Sorry about that. Previous. 18. Painful. stick would be easier. You see that the death rate had been varied enormously before and also after the introduction of the antiseptic treatment. It was very low in the 1840s, strangely enough, between 0 and 40%. Then there were peaks in 1854, 56, and so on. And then it was again low. And this all reflected, of course, these epidemics, these hospital epidemics, which were familiar to people. Now, conclusions are several. Lister was, of course, convinced. He selects. He contradicts himself because in another paper he gives data from a year before. Why did he choose only 3 years before and not more? Because before the general mortality was low. And I just insist this is an actual phenomenon of today as well, selection. Anyhow. And so it's no surprise that Lawson Tate had a better system of working in 1890, a kind of analysis and vision. How utterly futile our present work is, where everybody is treating everything in every kind of way, practically what you said. Therefore, we must plan deliberate and logical prospective experiments with well-defined groups allowing meaningful comparison. The fact is that he didn't do it himself, but and then he says, well, people oppose this and say this hampers the liberty of action, but our present liberty is not wise. Indeed, it's not liberty at all, but license. And here we come now to the question of objectivity, which you have already hinted at. So, what does clinical science mean? This is the background to all this big debate. And of course, for Lister, the distinguished man, by 1890 he was really in London, and I forget whether he was already Lord Lister, but anyhow you can see his distinguished man. It was, as a clinical science, was theory supported by laboratory experiment. Whereas for Lawson Tate, now still more combative, it was empirical observation expressed by numbers. So we come to the, we can call this numerical empiricism. We come now to the summary. I have shown you in the 18th century really a beginning of numerical methodical empiricism. There were publication of factual results, age-dependent lethality, prospective trials, huge numbers, historical controls, and many other authors as well. And we can say that in the 19th century, the publication of results was widespread. I repeat what you said. We have plenty of cumulative statistics, but no prospective comparative trials in surgery, as far as I know, still today. The one-sided statistics and cheating. You show what you want to show. Example, and the point is Joseph Lister. And you can ask what is really has been the role of statistical evaluation. And we can say that in the 19th century, the one-sided statistics had a limited progressive effect, whereas cheating, bandying with words, argumentation, and evasive philosophic rationalization neither contributed to progress of surgery nor therefore diminished patient suffering. That's quite tough, but it is like that. And I have some points for discussion. Of course, the 18th century argumentatively was farther than the 19th, and one can ask, why was the methodical empiricism forgotten in the second half of the 19th century? And then I draw your attention, you have done this as well, to the apparent parallelisme between 1800 and 2000. And there are, of course, also apparent differences. And if you want to know more, you go to the James Lind Library, where you'll find plenty of indication and historical examples, not only from surgery. Thank you.
So, are there any questions? Yes.
A number of questions. I'll just start with one. So I'm interested in sort of the emergence of this notion of bias in publication, and it strikes me that the sort of account that you're describing, intentionality is kind of linked in with bias. This idea that people are deliberately presenting data, or they're obscuring things, or whereas in the modern notion, the notion that we use in the 20th century, intention is mostly irrelevant. In fact, intentionality is kind of a marginal aspect of, usually we think of bias as something that occurs subconsciously, and either intention is irrelevant, or most of what happens in terms of bias is happening subconsciously rather than due to intentionality. And I'm curious to know whether, if you look back at the history of imputation of bias, where you see the role of intentionality being superseded by this notion of, do you see what I'm saying? Do you see any kind of, if you look back at these historical records, do you see any indication that people had notions of bias that were separable from intention?
Indeed, yes. I think that the example of Richerin, which I gave you, shows this clearly. But there in the 18th century, there are people who say we must include every case in order not to cheat, simply said. And they say it more elegantly. Absolutely. But
it's interesting, even in the case of...
You have also cheaters, of course, who are then accused by the others and say, well, this is an unfortunate habit to publish only successful cases, and we must have both and so on.
But it's interesting because the way that bias is moralized, and and everything that you're describing, even the word cheat there, there's kind of maybe it's unintentional, but there's something morally laden about that. Whereas today, at least in the statistics, people use it in a very it's an amoral concept.
Well, tradition nowadays that cheating is quite frequent. It's the whole secondary literature on that one. Today, with the clinical trials. Sure. You see. And does it? Yes?
Yes.
I have a question about social, historical context. You were talking about Cheselden, and you say you didn't really know why he started to make statistics. But I was wondering if his self-interest might be part of it. He was, after all, the person who led the charge to separate the surgeons from the barber surgeons guild, right? And he also was quite good at publicizing himself when he did become the most eminent surgeon in Europe at that time.
I had a relative close when I mentioned that they had a moral motivation. They had also several of them had also a personal motivation to get along.
But I will have another part to that too, and that Cheselden was kind of obsessed with accuracy. You remember that he was I think he was the first person to use a camera obscura, and in making his anatomical specimens. On the front page of Osteographia, he actually has his students using a camera obscura to draw a skeleton, right? Indicating to the reader that there's nothing mediating this exchange here. It's completely accurate. So
he certainly, I think you cannot exclude that he wanted to show how good he was. But the interesting thing about his publication of results is the age dependency.
That's right.
That's why I showed it.
Yeah, Jerry.
I would like to know whether there was a notion of interdisciplinary exchanges at the time. In other words, did any of these people who sort of were intuitively drawn to measure and to show their measurements associate themselves with mathematicians of the day, with people whose vocation it was to calculate?
I can answer this question for some of the physicians of this movement of medical arithmetic. Yes, For instance, there was a man called Hygarth in Chester, I think he worked, who was a friend of a mathematician. And he says, with the help of a mathematical friend, I have calculated and this and that. I have not found this with a surgeon. But they had a motive to, as you said, I mean, the criterion was very clear. It was, you have noticed, it was, except with the cataract, it was always survival or death.
Yeah.
Thanks. This is an observation really on the whole sort of trajectory that you've been talking about, that you pointed out that in the beginning the sort of traditional way of evaluating a surgeon focused very much upon the man, and then there's this whole focus of activity upon the evidence. And I was thinking now, the way in which audit and surgical audit is carried out really is sort of bringing these two strands together. So it's this sort of objective evidence, but actually in the context of that individual surgeon who's carrying it out.
The equilibrium between these two is extremely difficult and will never be stable and has changed over time, certainly. Now it's more on the evidence side a little bit. But particularly, I think, in surgery, you still have the master who teaches you the tricks. I mean, I think this is still present time. I just wanted to show these two boxes of the balance.
Well, if there is no other question, thank you very much.